Croeso, welcome to Blueprint Cymru. In Blueprint Cymru, we speak to people at the sharp edge of leadership and change. Today's guest is a former commercial barrister turned climate and nature advisor, board member, and leadership coach, Elspeth Jones. In 2025, she worked with the National Infrastructure Commission for Wales as their nature guardian in an innovative pilot, acting as a voice for nature within the Commission's governance structure. With over 20 years' experience in the legal world, including as an environmental activist and leader at the global environmental law NGO ClientEarth, she understands both the challenges and the huge opportunities for driving change through innovation and impactful law and governance. Her approach isn't about easy answers, but about building resilience, confidence, and clarity in those doing the hard work, something sorely needed in Wales. With nature in Wales in long-term decline, this is a conversation about the need to be bold, take action, and shift mindsets in law and governance to deliver real-world impact. Elspeth, welcome to Blueprint Cymru.
Thank you very much for having me.
Perhaps we could start where I start with all my guests. Tell us a little bit about your childhood and how you went from there to life in law and now working with and for nature.
Well, thank you very much for having me. So I was born in Bangor in North Wales, and I grew up in Gwynedd, just on the edge of Eryri, and then later moved on to Anglesey, where I went to secondary school. And after that, I spent time living and working in other places. So I lived in Oxford for a while, in London, and did some international work, and then moved back to Wales 10 years ago, and I now live in the Vale of Glamorgan in South Wales. So not far from Cardiff, actually, with my family. In terms of the work I do now, I tend to describe myself nowadays as a thought partner and adventure seeker, which is deliberately a bit vague because I like doing a lot of different things. But I think the connection between them all, or threads between them all, is that I tend to work at the interconnection of leadership, law, and environmental and social change. And I do that mainly through, I do advisory work, I do leadership coaching, and I sit on a number of executive boards as well. And I particularly sort of seek out new and innovative ideas and organizations. As you said, my background is in law. I studied law at Oxford University and then spent the first chapter of my career as a commercial barrister working in London. I did that for nearly 7 years, but sort of gradually came to this epiphany where I suddenly could see the climate and nature crises for what they were, and realized that I wanted to take that skill set that I developed as a barrister and deploy it in a different context to try and make a contribution to tackling climate change and nature loss. And so I moved over into the not-for-profit space, focusing on climate and nature, particularly the legal aspects of that. And my roles in that space have included, I was Deputy Chief Executive of ClientEarth, which is a global environmental law NGO, works all over the world using the law in its different guises to tackle environmental issues and climate change. And I was also Executive Director of the Welsh climate change charity, Size of Wales. And Size of Wales are largely based in Cardiff, and they work to protect and restore tropical rainforests, at least the size of Wales, and they also support tree planting programs in different parts of the world as well.
So that's quite interesting. I didn't know about Size of Wales, and I've always assumed it being quite a derogatory term. So people just throw, oh, it's about the size of Wales in. So it's good to see it being turned on its head and used in a positive way.
Yeah, that was the idea, actually. When it was founded, often the size of Wales was used as a measure of deforestation. So people would say an area the size of Wales was lost. And actually, when the organisation was created, it was really about turning that narrative on its head and showing what a nation the size of Wales can do globally in terms of tackling deforestation.
That's really lovely. But I think a lot of people would maybe assume that Wales is a green and pleasant land and has plenty of nature. And so, and everyone's got a lot of other things that they're concerned about and need to deal with day to day. So why should people really care? Why should they care about nature?
Yeah, well, a lot of people do see Wales as a sort of green and wild place, and a lot of people come on their holidays to Wales for to engage with nature or think they're engaging with nature. The Natural History Museum has something called the Biodiversity Intactness Index, which is basically a sort of index that looks at how much of a country's nature is still intact. And there's 240 countries or places in that index, and Wales comes in at number 224. So out of 240, so Wales is in the bottom 10%.
That's pretty shocking. Yeah, I didn't realise that.
It is shocking, isn't it? It's really quite shocking. And we do tend to like to think of Wales as this beautiful green place. We've got this fabulous coastline, coastal path, we've got our national parks, and we think of it as green rolling hills where we can escape into nature. But really, we're one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And what we're looking at when we go out into Wales is only a fraction of what it could be if nature was actually really thriving in Wales. There's also a report that's regularly done on the state of nature across the UK, and all the most recent reports consistently show decline in all monitored species across Wales. And in fact, in 1994, so I was just starting secondary school in 1994 at my local comp in Menai Bridge on Ynys Môn, and between 1994 and 2023, all the monitored species in Wales declined on average 20%. So many of us can probably remember where we were or roughly what we were doing in 1994, if we're old enough to have been around then. And it's quite terrifying to think that, looking at the baseline of 1994 to where we are now, so many species in Wales have declined so much, an average of 20% decline.
Yeah, one of the species I'm particularly sad about is the curlew. Because obviously it's a very iconic call.
Yeah, it is. And I think we can probably, so for me, like growing up, I was slightly obsessed with newts. I used to go off walking to local streams with some sandwiches and some jars and see if I could find newts. And I think that, that got me really interested in nature at a young age. And I have a pond in my garden now and I cultivate it, but for newts, I've not put any fish or anything in there. I'm like, this is going to be a haven for newts. And I think we've all got, species like that that we would just love to see thriving. But it's not even just about, we can all connect to particular parts of nature, but we're actually obviously part of nature ourselves as well. We're essentially a highly evolved ape. That's where humans have evolved from. And the people of Wales can only thrive if nature is thriving in Wales. So it's not just about saving those species that we love and the species that we like to see and feel connected to. It's about the integrity of nature and ecosystems, because if they start to collapse, then all the systems, natural and man-made systems that our lives depend on will also start to decline and collapse. So it's about the integrity of the whole chain of the ecosystem, from the very sort of unappealing, uncharismatic species in there, right through to the much more charismatic otters, the curlews, the newts, all those species that we love as well.
I've always assumed in comparison, say, to somewhere like East Anglia in England, where things have vastly changed for mechanized arable farming, that Wales has been quite gentle with the way it's changed its landscape. It's evolved with, or nature's evolved with man and woman, as farming practices obviously have evolved, but they haven't evolved as much. They're still rooted into that traditional upland farming. So I'm doubly shocked to hear what you say about the decline in nature in Wales, because again, as I just said, I think of it as something that, well, yes, humans have had an impact on it, and we can see the landscape has obviously been impacted by humanity, but at a slower rate. So have you any ideas as to why Wales has been hit so hard?
Yeah, so, well, I think farming in Wales is different to farming in other parts of the country. And we think of these rolling green hills in the uplands, but really, what we have a lot of. So I recently read a statistic that 90% of land in Wales is in managed agriculture. 90%, that's a huge number. And we have a lot of sheep farming, for example, especially in the uplands in Wales, and sheep just eat everything. So actually what we've got is vast areas that are sort of grazed cropped right down by sheep. So we have grass, we have a few other species that the sheep don't like to eat, or that can survive around the sheep. And then we have a lot of monoculture forests, pine forests, that are sort of all one species planted in rows for forestry. And when you first look at a landscape in Wales, you don't necessarily notice. You think, oh yeah, there's lots of trees, there's grass, it's green. You don't actually, a lot of people don't recognize that nuance, that actually it's fairly monoculture. There's not a lot of variety, and a lot of what would be there naturally is not there because it's been overgrazed and lost over the years. Or quite a while ago, a lot of indigenous trees were cut down to plant forests, and there's a move to sort of to plant pine forests, and there's a move over time to start removing those pine forests and replace them with the indigenous trees. But obviously, it takes a long time to restore the land in that way.
I suppose that would have all tied into the end of the First World War, when there's a drive for production, homegrown food and production of forestry and things like that. So up until that time, we were okay.
Yeah, I don't know the full history of it. I think there was some some lack of knowledge. When people were planting those pine forests, they didn't really appreciate the value of the native species and what role they were playing. So I think understanding of what constitutes a healthy ecosystem has really developed over time. And I think perhaps some of that was lacking. There's also a deep need to develop the economy of Wales, and doing that in a way, there can be a tendency to prioritize that over the natural world, which over looking after the natural world, which might lead to short-term gains, but over the long term, it's not a winning strategy. It's ultimately going to lead to further decline.
It's quite, again, the information you're giving me now is disturbing, and another level that I find it quite shocking is that I've always assumed Wales, and certainly as the Senate has gathered more powers, it's been quite innovative in its legislation and the way that it governs as compared to other parts of the British Isles. So how does Wales stack up when it comes to law and governance around the environment?
Yeah, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that. A lot of people think, Wales is really progressive in these areas, and I think on paper, there is a lot of good stuff that's come out of Wales and the Welsh government over the last 10 years or so. So the starting point is that environment is devolved in the UK. So it's a devolved, the environment is devolved to the Senedd and to the Welsh government. Before Brexit, a lot of environmental law across the whole of the UK came from the EU. My previous role at ClientEarth, we used to spend a lot of time working on improving EU laws because we knew that would trickle down across the European Union. Obviously, since Brexit, the UK has had to, and each of the devolved nations has had to sort of fill in the gap that is left after Brexit. And the cornerstone in Wales for that is the Environment Wales Act from 2016, and that sets out some decent stuff on paper, including a duty on all public bodies in Wales to have regard to and restore biodiversity and to produce biodiversity plans. We've also got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which integrates environmental goals with wider social, economic and cultural wellbeing goals and different ways of working. We've more recently got the Sustainable Farming Scheme in Wales, which is basically the subsidy scheme that replaces the old Common Agricultural Policy. And that, was originally very ambitious on nature and has triggered a lot of controversy in Wales and has been watered down over time. And then most recently, we've got something called the Environment Principles, Governance and Biodiversity Targets Act, which has just gone through the Senedd, and that is about plugging more of the governance gap after Brexit. Including laying the foundations for something that we call the Office of Environmental Governance for Wales, and laying the foundations for setting biodiversity targets. Now, the reason I tell you about all of that is because, on paper you look at that and you think, well, this is a fairly ambitious regime. There's a lot of good stuff in here. And we also had the Welsh government in, I think, 2021 declaring a nature emergency in Wales after it declared the climate emergency. And so there's a lot of good talk, a lot of good rhetoric. What we have seen as a result, though, is that it's not all actually trickling down into being implemented. So there's an implementation and enforcement gap. And so, if you're sort of skimming the headlines, you'll see Welsh government and Wales as a whole talking a good talk on environment, but what we're actually seeing in terms of outcomes is, there is no improvement yet.
And what is it going to need in order to bring that more civil servants, more informed civil servants, more informed public? How do we ensure that those good intentions and those policies and legislation that are there are enacted?
Yeah, and I think that that's the $1 million question, and I don't purport to have all the answers to that at all. I think there's quite a few interesting things that we're seeing develop and ideas emerging in the space. One idea that I was involved in recently is the idea of nature guardianship, which I think is a very interesting idea, and we can talk a bit more about that shortly. I think the new Office for Environmental Governance, when it's set up, will play a role. It's not the answer to everything, but it will play a role. It will be tasked with holding public bodies to account on their environmental duties. And then we're also seeing sort of innovation away from the sort of public body space as well. I don't know if you've come across Tir Natur, which is a new rewilding scheme that is just getting going in the Elennid, the Cambrian Mountains, and they have acquired a vast site. It's over 1,000 acres, as I understand it, for rewilding in the Cambrian Mountains. And so we're seeing things like that start to emerge, which are all really interesting. I think, you know, there is, as is always the case in Wales, I think, an issue around funding. You know, I've just read Will Haywood's book, Who Cares About Wales? And he talks about NRW, and you know, in 2024, I think it was, NRW only responded to 36% of the water pollution incidents that were referred to it. And when you look at that, you think, well, you know, there'll be a lot of different reasons as to why they only responded to 36%. But, you know, I would bet that lack of funding and resources is a big part of that. And so if we want these, if we're going to put duties on public bodies to do stuff and play their role in this system, then they do need to be resourced to do it. You know, whether it's the national parks that, you know, I think that I read a statistic that 20% of Wales is in national parks, so that's a great place to start. In resourcing these organisations and these bodies to be able to do what they're set up to do, I think is a fundamental part of it.
Absolutely. So you mentioned in then Nature Guardian, and was that part of the when you were part of the National Infrastructure Commission for Wales?
Yeah. So last year I was I took part in a really interesting pilot with the National Infrastructure Commission for Wales, and you know, I suppose a lot of people in Wales won't know what the National Infrastructure Commission is. So it's basically an independent, non-statutory advisory body funded by Welsh Government, and it provides impartial, long-term advice to Welsh ministers on strategic infrastructure needs. And in this context, when we talk about infrastructure, we mean things like Wales's energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, water, including flood defences, digital infrastructure, that sort of thing. And the Commission is explicitly mandated to look over a 5 to 80 year horizon. So it's got a long-term horizon, and it's, you know, like other public bodies in Wales, it's subject to the duties and the goals and the ways of working of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And it's also that biodiversity duty that I mentioned earlier. All public bodies in Wales have, you know, attaches to the Commission as well. And they in October 2024, about 18 months ago, they published a report called Building Resilience to Flooding in Wales. And one of the recommendations they made in that report was that Welsh Government should consider thinking about how to bring nature into its into flooding decision-making spaces, in adopting a sort of nature on the board, nature-centric governance type model, which is a really new and innovative idea. And you know, there's not many organisations doing it. And you know, perhaps unsurprisingly, the Welsh Government said we're not gonna take that one up. You know, because I think in big institutional settings, it can sometimes be hard to do the really edgy, innovative stuff. And so the commissioners at the Infrastructure Commission thought, well, actually, instead of waiting for a mandate or for Welsh Government to pick up this idea, we could be pathfinders. We could test out this model and see how it works and put some learning out into the world. So they basically decided to trial a nature on the board model and appoint a nature guardian. And so I joined the commission as their nature guardian, basically. And what that means, so a nature guardian is someone who is appointed to a board or into a decision-making space to represent nature in that space. It
does sound quite hippie.
Yeah.
It's just as an outsider, it sounds quite off the wall, but actually when you start thinking about it, it's very sensible.
Yeah, and so I think, and I think, you know, that points to what I really like about this model, actually, which we can go into a bit more in a minute, but it's about shifting mindsets. So it does instinctively feel strange. Why would we have somebody representing nature in these spaces? But nature is relevant to absolutely everything, from what you had for your breakfast this morning, to the clothes that you're wearing, to the chair that you're sitting on, to the AI that we're using in our workplaces. All of it, both in terms of origin and impact, connects with nature. And we have really externalized nature in all our decision-making spaces. And so, the idea of having somebody in the space to represent nature the idea is to disrupt the current sort of paradigm that we're all using, and to disrupt the current mindset, and spark a different kind of conversation. And so really, my remit was not very sort of, hippie at all. It was, I was charged with attending commissioners' meetings, receiving their reports, reading them, commenting on them, joining meetings with external stakeholders, meeting one-to-one with commissioners, it really acting like a commissioner. But my role was to act as essentially a nudge and a representation of nature, to encourage people to be thinking more about nature and bringing it into the conversation a lot more.
What is that in a practical so if you're a business, and you say, oh, that sounds like I like the idea of that, I'm going to appoint somebody as a nature garden, but what would they be doing? If I'm like I probably work in an industry that people consider extremely damaging to nature, being a mining engineer, but I know that from my perspective, on a mine site, we always consider, okay, do we really need to remove that tree? Where are we going to put the holes? Do we move it over there? Is there, like you said earlier about newts? Are there any newts? All of that sort of stuff. All of that is in our decision-making process already as a business or company to work for. So how does having a nature guardian on the board change that?
Yeah.
Or add to that?
Yeah. So it's interesting. When the commissioners decided to take this forward, their sort of initial feeling was, well, we're very progressive as commissioners. We're all very sustainably minded. We're engaging with environmental questions a lot outside of our roles as commissioners. That what difference is having a nature guardian actually going to make? And what we actually found was that right from the beginning, pretty much immediately at from the very first meeting that I was in, we noticed that the presence of the nature guardian in the room meant that more nature-related topics, questions, and contributions were being surfaced more frequently. And sometimes that was because I was asking a question or making a comment on something, but more often than not, it was the mere fact that I was sitting in the room and people could see me, and I was introduced to external stakeholders as the nature guardian. That in itself changed the conversation. It prompted people to ask more questions or contribute a bit more from their perspective and what they were doing for nature. And I think what it was doing and why that was happening is because it was sort of changing the social permission structure in the space. So it wasn't about, okay, well, we need to make sure we jump through these hoops to make sure we've done that environmental assessment, or it was bringing nature considerations right into the heart of the discussion space. And I think an example that might help to bring it to life a bit more. I mentioned earlier, public bodies in Wales have a duty under the under the 2016 Environment Act in Wales to prepare and publish a biodiversity plan. And an audit of that done by Audit Wales last year found that 49% of public bodies in Wales just haven't prepared and published the plan. So they just haven't complied with the duty. And Welsh Government isn't resourced to chase them up on it and make it happen. Nobody's been tasked with that. And that's part of why they're setting up the Office for Environmental Governance. It will hold public bodies to account on this sort of thing. But I would bet that if those 49% of public bodies had had a nature guardian on their boards or in their decision-making spaces, those plans would have been produced, because there would have been somebody internally saying, right, we need to make this plan. And so it stops being a sort of tick a box or an external compliance requirement, and it starts being someone internally championing it and encouraging people to do it. And that then, nudges decisions all across the organization in a myriad of ways that we can't predict all of them. But that's the sort of nudge and mindset change that nature guardianship is designed to trigger.
And I suppose there'll be some less charitable, maybe, and miserly out there might say, well, isn't this just another burden on my decision-making process and how I, run a business or run an organization? I already have to comply by environmental standards. So why do I need someone else that's making me feel guilty that I haven't bought recycled toilet paper or something?
Yeah, and I think that it's important to get away from the idea that this is a burden. It's actually, so we ran an evaluation at the end of the pilot at the National Infrastructure Commission, and more than 80% of the commissioners that responded to the survey said that it had been a positive or very positive experience. So it was definitely not perceived as a burden. If you are integrating a nature guardian into your existing governance structures, or what you're doing is adding another voice around the table that has a particular perspective. And it's very easy to think, oh, well, I'm very switched on about nature, and then completely forget about it when you're thinking about something else. But if you integrate those people into those spaces, then you're not adding another step to your process. You're not creating another burden. You're just adding another voice around the table. And I think that's the mindset shift here. This is not about putting more red tape on organizations, putting more compliance requirements on, and nobody's arguing for this to be mandated by law. It's a positive, simple, and relatively cheap step that boards can take, or equivalent to boards can take, by designating a seat at the table as a seat for nature. And exciting, great things can flow from that. It doesn't need to be a burden, and that person isn't there to block decisions. They're there to open up a wider space for conversation.
And so how does that all feed into the Office for Environmental Governance and its role, and what it will do for Wales going forward in the new Senate?
Yeah, so as I understand it, the Office for Environmental Governance will be tasked with holding public bodies to account on their environmental obligations in Wales. And so, the sorts of places we might see them stepping in once they exist. It doesn't exist yet. It will be set up probably post elections. The sort of thing we might see them getting involved in is, that 49% of public authorities that didn't publish that haven't produced and published biodiversity plans, for example. They can go after them, whatever that means, you know, writing them letters, engaging them, taking them to court, whatever it is, to force them to comply with the law. And you know, that provides an extra stick. You know, those public bodies right now are not producing those plans, and so so the office will, you know, I suppose, be a way of encouraging them to do it. Another place we might see them getting involved is, you know, NRW only responding to 36% of water pollution incidents reported to them. You know, they might put pressure on natural resources wells to make sure that they are doing everything that they can to pursue water pollution incidents. But what they can't do, well, firstly, you know, as with any public body in Wales, that they will inevitably have more to do than resources that they have. So they'll have to pick what they pursue. And so wouldn't it be better if these organizations were dealing with this at an earlier stage? You know, if you've got internal voices that are there to champion nature, more of those plans would have been published on time, and they'd probably be better because you've got somebody internal who's really championing them. Maybe more of these water pollution incidents would be being picked up. You know, you're catching things earlier through a softer engagement approach, rather than having to apply the stick of legal enforcement to all of these incidents. And then I think the other constraint is that the Office for Environmental Governance will really only be tasked with working with public bodies and ensuring that public bodies are complying with the law. So, you know, that leaves private companies, it leaves all sorts of other organisations across Wales that are outside the remit of the Office for Environmental Governance. And that's where, you know, the idea of integrating nature guardians throughout the system is a way of gradually shifting the whole system in Wales onto a more nature-friendly footing, without this becoming, you know, regulators constantly having to chase people with a stick to do this work. It becomes more internal and self-motivated.
Yeah, if the private company had it, imagine Ford Gething's career as a politician might have continued a bit longer.
Yes, so there is a private company, actually. Well, there are more than one private companies that have done this. So this idea has come out of the private sector. As far as I know, National Infrastructure Commission for Wales is the first ever public body to do it in the whole world, which is quite cool. But there is a very interesting company called Faith in Nature. They make shampoo and soap and conditioner and that kind of thing. You may have seen them in the supermarket. They're stocked in lots of different places. And they've really pioneered this idea of nature on the board. They decided they wanted to make nature the boss. You know, a lot of people have heard of Patagonia making nature their only shareholder, or Earth their only shareholder. Essentially, round about the same time that Patagonia did that, Faith in Nature appointed nature to their board. And Simeon Rose, the brand director at Faith in Nature, he's from Wales and still lives in Wales. And he's really pioneered this idea, working with an organisation called Lawyers for Nature. And you know, they've created a board seat for nature, which is amazing. And they're constantly asking themselves, like, what would nature say? What would nature want? And he's just written a book called Nature's Boardroom, just a little excellent little book that talks about their journey and how they've done it from a practical perspective. And you know, it's really not that expensive for a company to put somebody on their board to represent nature. And it's just one of those small tweaks in a system that can actually trigger, you know, quite major systems change once it gets going.
I love the idea, the concept, and as you say, I think it's like with many of these things, it's an evolution of mindset, isn't it? Really,
it is. There's actually one really nice metaphor that one of the commissioners at the Infrastructure Commission used when we were doing the evaluation. They said it's like like a ship. You know, it's heading north, say nature neutral, and you know, putting in place a nature guardian, you know, shifts the direction a couple of degrees to, you know, the west in a more sort of nature friendly direction. And you know, on day 1 or even day 5, you know, the difference in position is barely noticeable. But you look at, you know, 150 days down the line or further than that even, and actually you've charted an entirely different course from that one small shift. I think that's a really nice way of thinking about this.
It is. So my final question to you then, it would be, I always ask guests where they like Wales to be in 15 years from now, and where would you like Wales to be, or where would you like Wales and its view and acting towards nature be?
Well, I would love to see an abundance of nature in Wales, as probably self-evident from everything that I've been saying. But what I'd really love to see is, you know, is Wales really thriving, you know, the people of Wales really thriving from, you know, a really nature-based economy where people are healthy, they're connected to nature, livelihoods are interlinked with nature in a sort of mutually beneficial way. And I think, you know, as I said earlier, 90% of Wales's land is managed agriculture. 20% of that sits in national parks, and I think 7% is controlled by Natural Resources Wales. And I think that's a really great place to start. If we can start, you know, doing more interesting things with the land in those spaces, that ultimately creates a more symbiotic relationship with nature. You know, I think that's a really good place to focus. And then I think, you know, we're seeing bold, innovative ideas like the Nature Guardian at National Infrastructure Commission, you know, embedding more of those sort of little system tweaks in governance structures. You know, I'd love to see Nature Guardians all over Wales, moving things forward. Rivers, for example, there at the Usk and the Wye have both now have river guardians, which is, you know, the same idea as a Nature Guardian, but for the river. And wouldn't it be amazing if every river in Wales had a river guardian or someone representing the river when we're looking at landscape level? And then
really reconnect to pagan history.
Yeah, well, not even pagan.
The guardian of the river.
Reconnect with the fact that we are part of nature. You know, I think we've grown over the years we've just become separated, and to think of ourselves as separated. And I think certainly with the evolution of the digital world, it sort of cements that and compounds it. And actually, you know, recognizing that actually we are part of nature. We're not separate to nature, and you know, we need to give voice to these other parts of nature, and not just because they're beautiful and valuable in their own right, but also because we can't survive without them. And so, you know, we need to become much more nature connected. But also, you know, if the people of Wales are much more nature connected and our economy is much more nature connected, then what a beautiful future what a beautiful vision that would be for Wales. And I think, you know, ideas like this, the Tir Natur rewilding project, are really interesting. You know, and nobody's got all the right answers for how to do that sort of project, but seeing things like that spring up is really inspiring. So I'd love to see more of that sort of thing going on as well.
Elspeth Jones, diolch for being today's Blueprint Cymru guest.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
If you've enjoyed today's conversation, or you have any comments yourself about where you think Wales should be going, then please head over to the New Wales website and make your comments there, or donate to help our work continue. The website address is new.wales, and you can also find New Wales on YouTube, Instagram, and all the other socials you might care to think of. Diolch yn fawr for listening. Goodbye.